I just want to welcome everyone to the last session. Great that there are so many people in the room. And actually, I'm going to do a little shift, really a quick shift before I start the final session. What I want to do, along with the co-chairs, Avi Dechter, Gabriel Goldstein, Marcia Semmel, we really want to thank our brilliant leader, Melissa Yaverbaum. Stand up, Melissa. You know, we knew that this was going to be, to say the very least, a challenging subject, right? But of course, it was made even much more complicated after October 6th. That's undeniable. So to you, Melissa, we do express our profound appreciation to you for your remarkable efforts. You are the driving force behind this summit, and you deserve every accolade that comes to you. Your vision, your passion, your indefatigable energy. Melissa doesn't sleep. For those of us who were working with her, we got the emails at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I'm on the West Coast, so I knew how very early it was. But it's resulted in a summit that has sparked important conversations, but it's also set the groundwork for meaningful action against anti-Semitism going forward. We know we have a lot to do, but on behalf of the co-chairs and all your ardent fans here, I think you have many, all of the participants, we thank you for your exemplary commitment and contributions. So thank you. And now to our final session. I'm so delighted we have Eric Ward back with us and Amy Spitalnick. I'm just going to offer some very, very brief opening remarks, and then we'll sit down and talk. I will do very little talking. I won't need to talk at all. I mentioned earlier that I had recently retired, and with retirement comes, presumably, you're supposed to clean up all your files. You can talk to my husband about that, because what I've been doing is I'm going through stuff, but I find I'm just sort of sitting there reading, instead of throwing things out. So my house is a disaster. But I did have an opportunity, as I'm going through things, I was really struck, it's, I don't know how many years, maybe 100 years old, but John Dana Cotton, who was one of the founders of the modern museum movement, I just started rereading his book. He wrote, as I mentioned, nearly a century ago, but his thoughts about museums in American society, they really do remain fresh and relevant to us today. At the core of Dana's philosophy is that museums should be useful to individuals and society. And to be useful, museums should promote learning and be of service to their communities. And I think this is a really valuable prompt as we head into this final session. My head, I'm sure like yours, is awash with both the valuable ideas about ways to rethink the narrative of how our museums can address anti-Semitism and other forms of hate in ways that are useful to ourselves, to others, to the Jewish community, and to the nation at large. But I'm also, and I know you are too, we're really aware of the limitations of what we've been discussing. I want to be the optimist here to say I do think this has been an excellent beginning. We know we have to think differently, and I think we've gotten started in the past few days. So thank you all for being here. And I do cling to the hope, this is really something I've thought about, that in this time of division and fracture, that our collective narrative, it's not just one narrative, we have to think collectively, that it can remain a meeting place for commonality. History can be our common ground, even as it can be a contested history. History has this multiplicity of voices. It invites complexity, nuanced interpretations, thoughtful reflection. What could be a more appropriate way to close this summit than a conversation with Amy Spitalnick? Amy is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. In her prior position at Integrity First, she led the first successful lawsuit against the organizers of the deadly 2017 neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville. And of course, we welcome back longtime civil rights activist Eric Ward. We're going to think together about what we've learned and ways to move forward. I think I'm mic'd. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I really just want to start with a question. I think, Amy, I'll just start with you if I could find it. You are, you're both rare individuals. You're both uniquely situated by your past experiences and the work you're doing today to understand the roots of anti-Semitism, particularly in the United States. Eric, I know you've done some work abroad too. But really by way of beginning, and Amy, I'll just ask you first, how did you come to be so educated in this specific moment? And then Eric, thank you for your remarks yesterday. You can just expound on some of the things you said yesterday.
Well, first, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. It's been fantastic to hear the conversations over the last 2 days, and really just an incredible room of people, some of whom I've worked with and known before, and many new folks, and just grateful for everyone's engagement on this. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and if you had told me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago that I would be spending my career focused on anti-Semitism, dealing with neo-Nazis, thinking about these issues, I probably would have thought you were crazy. Because I grew up at a time in America, in New York, where really Jewish safety was at unparalleled and unprecedented levels. I remember thinking how fortunate we are to live in America at this time, to not have to worry about what my grandparents went through. There's been a lot of discussion about the Atlantic cover story, the golden age of anti-Semitism being over, and I think it puts a succinct point on the feeling that now we are no longer living in that golden age in the way that many of us, I think, thought we were. And so for me, it's really been being fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. In 2016, a few months before the election, I started in the New York Attorney General's office, just before we recognized that state AGs were really going to be in the front lines of protecting people's fundamental rights. And in November of 2016, when hate crimes started spiking around the country in response to some of the comments from the then president-elect and other leading figures, it became very clear that we were going to be grappling with a rise in hate crimes, not just the swastika that was drawn on my local playground, but so many hate crimes targeting so many communities that were exponentially increasing. Of course, little did we know how prescient really that would be. In 2017, we saw Unite the Right, this horrific, violent weekend in Charlottesville, and when I had the opportunity to work with an incredible group of lawyers to bring that lawsuit, I don't think we fully understood that Charlottesville was less an isolated incident and more a preview of the cycle of extremism that's followed. Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso and Buffalo and Jacksonville and so many other incidents. And of course now, as we sit here 5 months after October 7th, the way in which anti-Semitism in so many different forms has really become increasingly normalized in our society by elected officials, pundits, social media, and so many other places. And so it was really just a combination of being in the right place in the right time, first in the AG's office where we were well positioned to do something not just about hate crimes, but in taking on the Muslim ban and all of the other discriminatory policies going after folks' fundamental rights, to doing something about Charlottesville and the ways in which, again, it wasn't an isolated incident, to now, I started my job at JCPA full-time on September 5th. A month before our world exploded, certainly a interesting and challenging time to take over a legacy 80-year-old Jewish organization. Regardless, the fact of that is that I can't think of a better place to be in this moment. As we think about the path forward, it's one in which we have to resist our worst impulses, to put up walls and shut down conversations and turn our backs from others. And that is really where our work is focused, on how we, despite the challenges and the pain of this moment, continue to build bridges between communities, because our safety, our democracy, all of us are at fundamental risk in this moment.
Thank you.
Wow. It's good to see you, Amy.
Likewise.
One of my heroes.
And one of my heroes.
And
it's a love fest.
It's wonderful to see everyone. Judy, I'm trying to think how to be concise on this answer. And there's so many emotions. I don't know how folks are feeling like in the space. I wasn't here this morning, but I know that feeling when you get close to the end of the conference is very similar to like how I remember coming towards the finish line when I was in high school, like crossing the finish line. Your body and your mind starts to slow down, right? And one of the things they had to train us to do was you have to run past the finish line. So today I'm here to like run past the finish line. I hope everyone else is ready to run past the finish line, not just to it. We have all put in a lot of work over the last 2 days. And there, you can take a look around this space, you can take a look around it yesterday. I'm here to tell you as someone who spends almost half their time on the road, there aren't very many spaces like this. So don't be so quick to let your mind walk out of this. And I'm gonna come to the answer, but I'm gonna come to it through the back end. We are in a moment right now in this conversation, right now, right, where I think of an organization called Shaharet in Israel who talks about the moment of courageous conversations. I think about Greg Proper from Proper Daily. If you don't know the organization, it works with artists in the United States around social initiatives, primarily artists in Hollywood, who talks about uncomfortable conversations. And then I think of Audre Lorde, right, who once said, if I spoke to you in anger, at least I spoke to you, right? And that's the kind of energy, right, that we have been trying to build for years. And those who've been doing the work around CAJM, right, have been visioning what does that look like to rebuild a relationship. And CAJM, I promise I'm really coming to this, right, found a vision that understood that the path purely through political conversation wasn't going to happen, that we needed to find one another, right, through other vehicles, the vehicles of arts, morality, ethics, the moment we all find ourselves in. So I'm thinking about how I came to this, and I can give you lots of different building blocks that brought me to this very moment, to this very stage. But the one that I'm holding close right now, Judy, is a mentor of mine who just passed last week. Her name was Nadia Telsey. And Nadia was a badass, I think she would love this. She was a badass lesbian, right, who moved to Oregon in the 1970s, helped build the domestic violence network there, started one of the first self-defense gyms for women, right, in New York City. She was phenomenal. And I came to know Nadia. I thought, I used to think when I went to the University of Oregon, she taught a course there on self-defense. And I used to see her around campus, and I used to think to myself, right, when I grow up, I want to be a badass lesbian like Nadia too, right? She was just like a person who, as a working poor kid who came off the streets of Long Beach, right, looked up to. So I'll fast forward. This thing happens in Eugene, Oregon, where neo-Nazis make the mistake of canceling a show by a band I love here out of DC called Fugazi. If you know Fugazi, someone should introduce me, right? They were a band I love. Their show gets canceled, and it's at that moment, right? I'd had interactions with neo-Nazis before, but it was at that moment where I was like, a line has now been crossed, right? We just can't have Nazis in Eugene, Oregon, was my kind of summation of that, that it was too much. I started to try to understand that work, and a lot of people had different influences. Ken Stern from the American Jewish Committee, of course, the Oregon Jewish Museum, right, which was such a repository. Folks who were political dissidents, like Leonard Zeskin, the Chip Berlays. It was broad, but it was Nadia who had a real impact on my life. We were at the time in the 80s connected to a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in Louisiana. Some folks may have heard of them. They're the first group to actually lead, right, community trainings on understanding racism in America. And I think it was called Undoing Racism. And I was part of a group in Eugene, Oregon, in Lane County, who was leading workshops as part of the anti-apartheid movement and the Central American Solidarity Network, right, at the time. And we wanted white allies to be stronger allies on this issue. Well, these things coalesced. And I decided very early on, without the academic backing, right, that anti-Semitism just looked like racism to me. It didn't function like other kinds of forms of bigotry. And I really advocated to this group called Clergy and Laity Concerned, first started, Martin Luther King Jr. was the first chair, right? That's the organization I worked with in Oregon, that we should include a segment on anti-Semitism, right, in this Undoing Racism. And just to put, we're talking like the early 90s, right? So this conversation isn't new. And I wasn't the first to come up with that piece. I just found the organization that said, that sounds kind of right, let's do it. Who are the trainers? So I went to Nadia Telsey and another person named Erwin Naparstak, who also is passed now. And it turned out they had been doing workshops in the 60s and 70s on anti-Semitism. And so I invited them into our training. It was the first time I sat in a workshop on anti-Semitism. And it transformed my understanding, not only of how anti-Semitism functioned as a system, right? Not just people saying rude things, but it also strengthened my understanding of how racism functioned. Let me give you a comparison. I'm terrible at foreign language. I'm terrible at English, let alone anybody else's language. And, but the truth is my terrible French, please do not come speak to me in French when we are done, right? My terrible French helped me learn English grammar, right? I never understood English grammar until I had to learn French. And then I learned things about verbs and adverbs, nouns, right? Things that I needed to be able to understand French. The truth is the way that we get to understand a form of oppression is by learning another form of oppression. It helps us build our muscles, right? So when people say to me, right, how come you get anti-Semitism so well? It's because through learning anti-Semitism, I learned the nuances of racism, right? And anti-Black racism. And when I understand those nuances, it helps me sit up and speak more strongly. But here's the challenging part, and we'll get to more because that was a long opening. Here's what I want to put out to folks. The problem around promoting an understanding of anti-Semitism is I'm pretty sure we sit in a society right now of Jews and non-Jews who actually aren't that interested in promoting an understanding of anti-Semitism. What they're interested in is promoting a political position, right? And it is about winning and defending a political position, not understanding that there is an existential reason to promote the education around anti-Semitism. Because it is a threat to democracy, because it fuels political violence that doesn't just target Jews, but non-Jews. Whether we're talking about Charlottesville, whether we're talking about Latinos being targeted at a Walmart in El Paso, African-American worshipers in a church in Charlotte, South Carolina, Sikhs worshiping in Wisconsin, these mass murders were driven by individuals who were racist, Islamophobic, xenophobic, but they believed they were carrying out a war against the existential threat of a Jewish conspiracy. The truth is, it's not about political positioning. It is about understanding. It is driving physical threats against all of our communities. It is undermining democracy. And for me personally, the reason I came to really advocate against anti-Semitism is because I learned fundamentally anti-Semitism is anti-Blackness. Anti-Semitism, as it functions in this country, seeks to deny the power and legitimate grievances of Black people. It says, right, that we don't have any legitimate grievances. It's just our Jewish puppet masters pulling our strings. There's nothing wrong with society. Inequality is overspoken. You see, it's just a conspiracy to destroy white Christianity. In one fell swoop, anti-Semitism denies the legitimacy of what I call the Black radical project in America, which is the formation of an inclusive democracy that says that everyone has the right to live, love, worship, and work free from fear. That's how I came to understand anti-Semitism was important, and I'm going to talk about what we can do about it in a few more questions.
Bravo. Thank you both. So, 7 years ago you wrote Skin in the Game?
7 years.
I think it's in the engagement guide. I hope everyone's had a chance to read it. It's been widely cited. I want Eric and then Amy too, but what did you think of its reception at the time, and how have things changed since you wrote it?
Yeah.
And then similarly for you, Amy, how did the article affect you when you first read it and now? So Eric, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so it's funny. As I was writing Skin in the Game, I was sitting on a stage in a shul synagogue in New York, next to the head of a very large Jewish communal organization. And I gave kind of the first, actually was the second kind of verbal expression of the thesis around Skin in the Game. The head of that large Jewish communal organization followed me and said to the audience, with great reception, anti-Semitism isn't really a threat in the United States anymore. It is an international phenomenon, right? When you read Skin in the Game now, it's conventional wisdom, right? Not just because folks have read it, but because of what folks are experiencing and seeing, right? But the truth is the reception to Skin in the Game wasn't significant until Charlottesville, right? That's when folks started to pay attention. And Skin in the Game is provocative, right? It puts out some really provocative pieces, both to the Jewish community and to the non-Jewish community, right? It challenges the Jewish community around its need to define itself as white, right? Which I think is grounded in fear. And I'm not saying a bad fear. I get the fear as a Black man walking through the streets of America each and every day. I'd love for folks not to be able to see me as Black in that way, right? The chance we watch in the Black community is folks try to pass out of safety. But the truth is that Jews are not white. And you don't get to be part white or not half white in that kind of way. And that was super challenging, not just for folks who might be more conservative, but also for white Jews on the left, right? The second was the challenge around, I didn't speak much to anti-Semitism on the left, and though I do address it. And that was very challenging to folks because, like I will still say today, right, the main threat of anti-Semitism in this country is anti-Semitism being organized by the white nationalist movement. It is intentionally, it's not stumbling into anti-Semitism because of its unconscious stereotypes and biases and arrogance. It is seeking to intentionally organize anti-Semitism as a form of political power. And that makes it something very, very different. The third is, I think it was a sigh of relief, right? Folks say, well, Eric, you get anti-Semitism, and it doesn't seem like very many people on the left. Oh yeah, I'm on the political left, actually, if you don't know that about me, full disclosure, right? Or as an African American. But the truth is there's lots of folks within communities of color and on the left who understand anti-Semitism. The problem is those aren't the folks the Jewish community are interested in engaging in, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about building something in common. It's about winning a debate or a position in American society. And that has always been the tension with non-white communities in America, fighting to be on the higher rung, Because who wants to be the faces at the bottom of the well in a system known as white supremacy? The real truth is people still struggle with the questions around skin in the game because it calls into question the very ways we see ourselves and our identities in this moment.
No, thank you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the ways in which Skin in the Game, when it came out 7 years ago, really, again, previewed what became clear to so many of us, not just in Charlottesville, but in Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso, Buffalo, and so on, is just remarkable in so many ways. And I think now, as we think about this moment that we're in, it's the lesson that we need to not forget, despite the loudest voices telling us to throw it out. And that doesn't mean that we are not also confronting the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests on the left, but rather we need to wholly rethink how we approach anti-Semitism in general. We look at anti-Semitism as this siloed particularist phenomenon in terms of how we teach it so often, in terms of how a number of communal institutions really treat it. And in this moment, we are seeing, not just because of the cycle of violence that we talked about, but the ways in which anti-Semitism is utilized and normalized by elected officials and by leaders of all different stripes right now to, on the right, of course, create a political movement, as Eric talked about, that is rooted in these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and tropes, and on the left, to isolate and alienate Jews from the very coalitions we need in order to fight the rising tide of extremism and bigotry in this country. And so if we are not understanding how interconnected this all is, the ways in which anti-Semitism doesn't operate simply as a traditional form of racial or religious or ethnic prejudice, but as this overarching conspiracy theory that makes each and every single one of us and our democracy unsafe, none of us will ever be safe. And yet this isn't the framework that we fundamentally talk about anti-Semitism in. And so that's really, for me, both in the work that we did at Integrity First, and Eric has been one of my best thought partners and friends in so much of this work for that very reason. But I think in so many ways, right now as we grapple with the post-October 7th world, that message is all the more important. And I'll just say a couple specific things. First, at JCPA, at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, we just wrapped up some message research in partnership with a few different organizations. And what we found was that among 18 to 34-year-olds, which are the demographics so many are wringing their hands about right now, the message that actually helps them understand their stake in fighting anti-Semitism is one that connects the dots to their own safety, the personal impact, and our democracy. If we say that we should be fighting anti-Semitism simply because it's the right thing to do, that doesn't really land. If we help people understand that it is in their own self-interest to take on anti-Semitism because hate begets hate and it is used to fuel the cycle of bigotry, and because it fundamentally undercuts our democracy, that helps people understand why they need to care. Should it be that way? I don't know. But I think that is human nature. And I think that would probably be true for a variety of different forms of hate if you'd conducted similar research. I've also been spending about the last 8 months, Eric is actually an advisor on this among some others, on a report that is coming out later this month on precisely this question, how we can actually better connect the dots between anti-Semitism, Jewish safety, and our democracy. How do we actually break through this siloed way in which we've been treating anti-Semitism and better help people understand that the fight for Jewish safety is the fight for our democracy, is the fight for each and every person's safety in this country. And part of that means acknowledging that, again, that siloed way we've approached it, the ways in which we like to say in moments like this, we are going to put up these walls and we're going to pull back from our relationships with others because of the deep pain and isolation, some of it well warranted that many of us are feeling right now, means that we are actually putting our own safety at risk. It means that we are stepping away from the relationships and the conversations and the spaces that we need to be in for our own safety as Jews, in addition to the safety of so many others in our communities. And so rooted on sort of the findings of this report and so much more, we're also building out work at JCPA on how we can mobilize not just Jews, but our allies and our partners in again, not just combating anti-Semitism, but understanding and explaining its connections to other forms of hate, to anti-LGBTQ hate, as we see neo-Nazis mobilize around anti-drag and anti-trans events, as we see white supremacists mobilize around anti-abortion panic, as we see, of course, the cycle of extremist violence that has targeted so many different communities. And again, as we now see in this post-October 7th world, the ways in which anti-Semitism is used to isolate and alienate and split Jews from the very coalitions we need. So as we sort of lean into this work at perhaps the hardest moment to try to lean into cross-community work that we've seen in at least my lifetime, so much of what Skin in the Game really brought to the fore 7 years ago is still top of mind for me, for our team, and for so many folks we work with, because we have no other choice. It's the only path forward for Jewish safety and for so many other people's safety.
Thank you. I think what we're, the two words building trust have been bubbling up, I think, amongst us. We haven't, I don't think, addressed it directly with any of the panelists. So it's very clear we need new narratives. I think that is something I hope we agree, has come out of this summit. We need new narratives to talk about anti-Semitism. And I think my particular question to both of you is, how do museums create trust to house these narratives? What do we do?
Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing I just want to tell, I want to tell everyone here, this relates to museums. Look, time is shorter than folks think, right? We are, in America, even on the political left, we are exceptionalist. We don't believe that things that happen in every other country around the world can happen here, right? And so we deny, right? It's hard to imagine the unimaginable, like this mosquito who likes me.
Everybody likes you.
Well, yeah, this one a little bit more. It's hard to imagine the unimaginable. And so I'm here to be honest, right? We need our institutions to be more responsive and much more quickly to what's happening. And one thing that museums can do, right, is to fight to defend spaces just like this, right? The folks who actually want to be in movement together, in space together, is a very precious thing in a moment of extremism. No one likes the thing that looks like bridge builders. Look at almost every sectarian moment around the world. The folks who get targeted are the folks who are labeled as moderates, right? The bridge builders. Those are typically the ones who pay the price. And our institutions often stand aside rather than defending those folks and those spaces. So that's one thing that museums can do in this moment. The second, right, because they're museums, is to recognize, as other folks said yesterday, right, and I think someone said on the panel earlier than me, the fear that exists. All of us are afraid to have that conversation that we want to have in this room, right? The reason we all came here was to have that connection with one another. And it's the fear of saying something wrong or not getting it right or not being understood, right, that is preventing us from having the conversation. Yesterday, folks who identify as people of color or Black descent, we all met, we huddled in a room together. It was hot in there, by the way, but it was also hot in the sense of the amount of energy. I've never stood in a standing huddle with so many people of color who actually want to lean into this conversation around anti-Semitism, right? And the one question that kept coming up is, okay, we are ready to have this conversation around anti-Semitism, around bigotry. We want to be engaged. We want to build groundwork. Where is the lean in from the other side, right? And folks are so busy. This is just love to the Jewish community, non-Jews of color. I'm leaving Jews of color out just for a second here, right? I want to tell you, you all are focused on the wrong folks. You are trying to wage a battle of opinion when your energy should be into building the coalition, right, that is going to move us all forward together, right? I don't use October 8th. What I talk about is the day that Jews on this planet suffered one of the worst mass killings, right, since the Holocaust. It's important to name it because when you name it, you are actually joining communities that have suffered catastrophes of their own. I'm not saying of the same level because I'm not here to build hierarchies. What I'm here to say is that there are communities who understand what it's like to be targeted in that way, right? To face moments of intense discrimination. In these moments, what museums can do is to stop us from going inside of our silos, right? And reminding us of the things we have in common. I have a list here, right? This is how powerful that meeting was today. Here's a list of names, right, of the folks of color who were in the room, who signed this paper, right, saying to everyone in this audience, we are ready to have that conversation together about what can we build together that moves us forward, that defends democracy, that takes on and challenges bigotry, right? The question to folks who weren't in the room is, what are you willing to step up? And we're urgent to have this conversation. We've committed to doing the work to prepare to have that conversation, to deepen our understanding around anti-Semitism, right? To deepen our knowledge around the questions of Zionism and anti-Zionism and Israel. We're prepared to do our homework because we want to be connected in this moment. We want to sit with others who understand that it's important to defend this moment in democracy and defend spaces like this. We're urgent. And so one of the things, right, museums can do is to help that happen. And not 5 years from now, not 3 years from now. Let's make it happen. We're the folks, right? This is Obama. I'm going to quote Obama for the first time, right? We're the people we've been waiting for. Yeah. Stop looking elsewhere and let's invest in one another. That's what museums can help us.
Bravo. There's not much to add to that, but I'll just say, look, I think we can't be afraid of the elephants in the room. For so long, but certainly in the last 5 months, I think there's been a fear of actually having the conversations that we need to be having. And the ways in which museums and art and culture institutions are uniquely positioned to provide the safe, constructive spaces for this is more urgent than ever. The most optimistic I felt in the last 5 months was a couple weeks ago sitting with Eric and our friend Waj Ali, not far from here at Georgetown Day School, where we did 2 days of conversation for parents, students, faculty on this moment. And it was billed as talking about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and frankly, I think even the school tried to have a caveat in some of the material saying this is not about Israel, this is about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But we leaned into talking about Israel and talking about Gaza and not shying away from it, not because the three of us agreed. I think all of us have fundamentally different perspectives on what needs to happen specifically. But I think we were able to find the place of shared values and shared humanity and cut through all of the false binaries of this moment, the loud polarized voices, and actually have conversations as human beings. And museums, and again, arts institutions and all of the spaces you represent are even better positioned than some of these educational institutions in many ways to create that space. And it can't be considered political or partisan to lean into these conversations on hate, on democracy, on how geopolitics impacts what's happening here. And it doesn't mean that we are necessarily becoming foreign policy organizations or public policy organizations. It means that we're understanding the context of the world in which we are living and its very real ripple effects on the lives of each and every one of us, and creating the space to actually have those conversations and break out, again, of those false binaries and the ways in which so much of this conversation has really been, sort of to Eric's point, it's been hasbara, it has been loud public campaigns that are somehow devoid of the real community relations and bridge building we need to be doing in this moment in order to actually build the coalitions we need to then move forward. And there's important, look, I spent a good part of my career in PR, and so I see the value in big public engagement campaigns. But if we are doing that without the grounding, without the relationship building, without the space for the hard conversations, we're never going to be able to actually move the needle.
Thank you. I think you get a clap too.
Yes.
Brilliant, brilliant. And maybe we can just drill down a little more and think about successful models. And I just want to mention, if you haven't read Eric's maybe not your latest article, it came out last week, you probably have something since then, but in Moment magazine, Eric published the most beautiful, poignant recollection of Alexei Navalny, who both Eric and Alexei won the Civic Courage Prize a year apart. So Eric, you were reflecting on that. But one of the things he said in the article, which I found so interesting, is how Navalny, he held views as a younger person, and as his views changed, he refused to sort of erase his past way of thinking. He wanted it out there, he wanted it very public because he wanted people to see that he could change. That's not the norm these days, right? We're all so entrenched in our own convictions that change really does seem to be impossible. So Eric, you're a community organizer. Eric and my husband were fighting neo-Nazis in the streets of Portland in the 1990s. But how do we work around differences? How do we build communities? And maybe Amy, I'll just start with you, but what are some successful models that might help us in our work in museums, libraries, archives?
Yeah. Well, look, I think about our Charlottesville case often not because it's the model for how we do this across the board, but because it actually was, the definition of what an intersectional effort looks like. Our plaintiffs were 9 diverse Charlottesville community members who were injured in the violence, led by sort of a team of Jewish women lawyers and me as the leader of the nonprofit. And it really brought together a cross-section of people who not just were horrified by what happened and impacted by what happened, but recognized that our futures and our fates were inextricably linked, and that the anti-Semitism, the Jews will not replace us, was directly tied to the xenophobia and the anti-Black racism, and of course, again, that cycle of violence that followed. And in moments of crisis like this, we have no choice but to figure out how we can actually build those coalitions and those bridges. And that's, at JCPA, we work very closely with Jewish community relations councils around the country. There's 125 of them. I know many of you work with your local JCRCs. And these are exactly the questions many of them are thinking about in different ways depending on the communities. In some places more successfully than others, based on many different factors and dynamics. In other places with more support and resources from the institutional Jewish communal spaces where they operate, or in other places with better partners than perhaps in others. And so what we are thinking about now is, as we move into this sort of post-October 7th moment, as we bring this sort of, we call ourselves an 80-year-old startup at JCPA because we've been around for 80 years. We're played a really sort of key role in mobilizing the Jewish community around the civil rights movement in the 60s, but I think in many Jewish communal spaces sort of lost our way a little bit. And leaned out from the work, from the bridge building, from the coalition building, from the fundamental justice work that is really existential to our own safety as Jews and to so many others. And we are now trying to lean back into that while not being naive about the moment that we're in. And so what we're seeing work is doing just that, right? So after October 7th, many of us remember that, of course, I think many of us have been so focused on the anti-Semitism that's been directed at our own communities that Sometimes it's hard to see the pain and suffering of others, and the fact that the Muslim and Arab American communities have been facing very real, not just bigotry, but in a number of cases, specific hate and violence, including the murder of a 6-year-old in Chicago, and the shooting of 3 Palestinian American students. And we decided to organize a statement of Jewish organizations speaking out against Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate. And I expected we would get a couple dozen organizations and we would put it out and it would at least be something. We got 160 Jewish organizations, local federations, JCRCs, national organizations, who, despite some of the loudest voices telling them we shouldn't be also talking about Islamophobia in this moment in addition to anti-Semitism, realized that that was actually not just the right thing to do from a Jewish values perspective, but also existential to our own safety, because they then used that statement to open lines of conversation with their local Muslim and Arab American neighbors who they haven't really been able to engage with post-October 7th, because everyone is in very real pain and grief right now. And in turn, begin actually having those conversations about local rising hate crimes, about how we can mobilize together in this moment at a time when all communities are really feeling that pain and that fear. And so even in that really dark moment in October, I was just heartened and found so much hope in the fact that there were so many Jewish organizations willing to put their names on this, and the reaction that they got locally from their local partners in the Muslim and the Arab American communities, who appreciated it and in turn saw it as an opportunity to reciprocate the concern and the relationships. It's not perfect. There's so much pain right now, and we have to acknowledge that as well, but I think there are these reasons for hope and these models of how, if we actually aren't afraid of those elephants in the room, if we just lean into what we all know, not just we as Jews are grappling with, but what so many communities are grappling with right now, there's a path.
Amen. Yeah. I mean, what was the question again? Because really what I want to say right now is I just want to thank, I really just want to thank Amy, right? And, you know, folks don't know this story of Charlottesville. They know what happened in Charlottesville. They don't know what happened after Charlottesville, right? The threats, the harassment. It ignited, right, physical assaults, right, on people across the country, demonstrations. I lived in Portland, Oregon. I lived, and Judy lived, under 6 years of political violence on the streets, right, that would shock you, right? This was happening in Berkeley. This was happening in Seattle. This was happening in the streets of New York. Folks forget what happened and what was unleashed after Charlottesville. And it was the work of Amy and her team, right, that drove those folks off the streets through that political campaign. When that lawsuit, when that verdict came in, it chilled the alt-right off the streets of America. And it was felt almost immediately. The work of that campaign built a coalition in itself of supporters who crossed lines to come together, because it wasn't just about fighting anti-Black racism. Richard talks about this, right? It wasn't just about fighting anti-Semitism or homophobia or misogyny. We understood that we had something larger in common, that this was a fight against organized bigotry. And it brought us together, and it reminds me of being a punk rocker, right? So, you know, you knew that was coming, right? Look, I grew up, I was born at a time, I like to remind folks, I was born at a time in America, and you're looking at Eric right now and saying, but he only looks 30.
No, we're not saying that.
I know. I was born at a time in America where Black people legally were not considered to be full human beings in this country, right? And for my grandparents, imagining that that would ever change was unimaginable to them until it happened, right? It is important for us to understand. It's hard to imagine that we have things in common. We have mass media that makes its profit at telling us how much we have how different we are from one another, how much we don't understand one another. It's why the media loves to focus on Black-Jewish tensions in America, right? It is the classical, right, man bites dog story. And it's largely told through the lens of non-Black people, right, and folks who aren't Jewish. And we never ask ourselves, why does that story get told over and over again? The truth is, right, what we have to understand is we're not going to come together because we are Black or Jewish or Asian American or Latino or Black in America. We're going to come together because we find something we have in common that becomes another identity. When I was that punk rocker growing up in desegregated Long Beach, California, I can promise you, when I got bused to that white high school, right, with the children of the governor, Duke Majan, right, we weren't going to find lines across, we weren't going to find our ways together across lines of class, right? We weren't going to find our togetherness across lines of religion, right, or race. But this new thing appeared, and it was called punk rock. And it was hip hop too, but we didn't know the difference, right? We just knew it wasn't Captain and Tennille, right? And it wasn't Barry Manilow, right? It was something that was our own. And it became another identity upon which we built a new set of relationships. And it is those relationships that brought us together to stand on the streets of Portland, to defend the victims of hate crimes, to try to fight for policies, right, and equity in our community. So the truth is I think the way forward is to realize that we are building this new identity. And it's folks who believe in inclusive democracy. It is folks who believe that there is both something exciting, right, and anxiety-filled about being in the room together, and that excitement and anxiety are both okay. And that we don't overcome the anxiety ever. I don't know if you're afraid to fly, right? I have a friend in Chicago who's terrified of flying. He's a national field organizer. He probably spends half his week flying around the Midwest, right? One of the bravest people I know. And you think too, how does he do that, right? Well, the truth is he still has anxiety flying. He can't overcome it. But what he's learned to do is manage it. And what he says is, I didn't learn how to manage it by staying off the plane. I learned how to manage it by flying as much as I could. Wow. What we need to do is to lean into one another as much as we can, to find excuses to work with one another, but to open up the courage to have real conversations, right? I'm not a person who cares whether a person is Zionist or anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. That's not my thing when I'm looking at the Jewish community, right? It's not the important piece for me. The important piece for me is it someone who wants to stay in the room and wrestle and find a way forward? That's what brings me into the space. And I'm looking for other folks, right, where that brings them into the space too. Other folks are afraid of that because it challenges in these sectarian moments, these hard positions that we're supposed to take. No one likes nuance in a moment of sectarianism, right? No one likes the idea of compromise in a moment of sectarianism. But the truth is it's those things that we need in this moment. That's what allows us to build a new way forward. Courageousness means building the container to be able to have conversations around the topic of genocide, right? To be able to have conversations when my friends talk about colonial settlerism without any irony about where they live and who's been displaced in this country, right? It's about having the courage to go back and forth, not because I'm going to convince someone, but I want to know where they stand, and I want them to know where I stand, and I still want us to be clear, regardless of where we stand. We better make sure we have a place to stand. And there's no place to stand if we allow this democracy to fall in this country. I promise you. What is coming in this country in the name of authoritarianism? Doesn't care about Israel, does not care about Palestinians, It does not care about those of us in this room. And we should understand in this moment, we also need to take that seriously. And we can't do anything about it unless we're willing to move together on it. That's one of the things I think that I've learned, right, over these last 30 years.
Thank you both. Well, I hate to switch gears. I wish we could kind of stay in this spot, but I'm looking at Amy's watch, and I know time is of the essence, and I think it is really important to just address this issue that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic or is anti-Semitic. I'm just going to quote from Dara Horn. If you saw her article in The Atlantic on February 15th, she absolutely chillingly and in her way somewhat poetically says this: Jews are now required to recite this humiliatingly obvious sentence that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic over and over as the price of admission to public discourse about their own demonization in debates with people who often are unable to name the relevant river or sea. I'm just going to ask you to respond.
Well, I actually don't think it's changing gears at all, because I think that is precisely how the coalitions we need in this moment are being split. So whether it is the sort of right-wing extremism and authoritarianism we know well and is easier for us to identify and call out, targeting immigrants and Jews and Black people, or it's what we've seen over the last 5 months, but of course long before that as well, those saying Zionists aren't welcome here, or what happened on October 7th either didn't happen or is a good thing, or celebrating the death of Jews, or basically saying Jewish lives don't count in some way, or the rape of Jewish women doesn't count in some ways, or the kidnapping and continued hostage taking of Jews doesn't count in some ways. All of that is intended to not just, of course, be anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism, but again, it's intended to really split Jews from the spaces, from the coalitions, and say that we are not part of the broader story of us, the broader network, the broader space we need in this moment to keep all of us safe, to take on the rising tide of extremism, authoritarianism, and protect our democracy and each of our safety. And so I truly don't think it's changing gears in any way, shape, or form, because it is the same conversation. And if we can't recognize that, if we can't at the same time say, yes, right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism are manifesting in different ways. Right-wing anti-Semitism is typically manifesting in the cycle of mass shootings and other extreme violent forms of hate, targeting synagogues and Black churches and Hispanic communities and so many others. And right now, at least in the last, thank God, we haven't seen left-wing anti-Semitism become as violent, but it doesn't mean that it's not a threat. It doesn't mean that it's not a dire situation, again, not just for Jews, but for everyone. And so understanding the different ways in which it is manifesting, the ways, again, in which Jews are being split from the very coalitions we need, and being effectively categorized into good and bad Jews based on their connection to Israel, their willingness to say, yeah, they, renounce Israel, they renounce Zionism, the ways in which the term Zionism itself is both fundamentally misunderstood and twisted and used as a stand-in for Jews in so many cases. If we're not able to, again, have those conversations, lean into those conversations and call it out where we see it, we're never going to be able to be in the relationships and the coalitions we need right now. And so being clear-eyed about it, understanding that our pain and our grief and our fear right now is real and it counts, and we can hold that while also not losing sight of our responsibility to others is, I think, the only path forward.
Yeah. So the way that I think about most conversations around Zionism or critiques around Zionism always strike me very close to the way that I hear most white folks talk about crime in America, right? And what I mean by that is, do you think I believe anti-Semitism influences much of the way people discourse around Zionism? I absolutely do. I also think racism drives most of the ways that white folks talk about crime in America too, right? And what I tell folks, in the same way that I talk about crime, I'm not saying I won't talk about crime with white folks. I'm just saying it'd be great if you did a little homework first, right? Because if you don't, I imagine it won't be more than 3 minutes into that conversation before you say something that offends me. Now, I may not say anything about it, right? And I imagine if you don't do your homework, you're going to vote and support policies that actually cause harm, right, to the communities you say you want to be in coalition with, right? And I think it's very much, look, forms of bias are not just conscious decisions that we make. They are also unconscious, right? The unconscious, locking your door when a black person is walking down the street, right? There are unconscious forms of anti-Semitic bias that function in our society. And left unnamed, they carry influence, right, into our conversations and the choices we make. Do folks act in racist ways unconsciously each and every day? I'm here to tell you yes. Does that make everyone David Duke, right? Absolutely not, right? And in the same way, we have to do a better job of distinguishing, right? Not every person who acts in an anti-Semitic way automatically becomes David Duke in America, right? It's actually just a function of anti-Semitism in our society. And again, we have to nuance it, but we're not nuancing it if we're trying to win a political position, I suspect, right? If we're trying to win a political position, we are doing what most politicians do in a campaign each and every day, right? To find the thing that drives and undercuts credibility. But here's the deal. Is most of the critiques of Zionism driven by anti-Semitism? I think absolutely. How could it not, in the United States of America, be driven by anti-Semitism? It should not shock us. It should just tell us that anti-Semitism exists in the United States, and we should choose to not be walking memes. We should choose to be the people who do something about anti-Semitism in America. That's it.
Thank you. I'm just checking one more question. Okay, just we want to end on a note of hope.
Oh, hope.
We
I'm full of
can. Well, how can we not be cowed by fear given the extremism in our midst? So where are the nuggets of hope? Where do we see inclusive democracy prevail?
I'm going to let
set us
I'm
forward.
going to be quick and give Amy. Amy gives me hope. Jewish Council for Public Affairs gives me hope. Race Forward gives me hope. CAJM-IMLS gives me hope. IMSL gives me hope, right? You all give me hope. And it's okay to be afraid, right? I would tell to the Jewish community, you have a right to be afraid, right? What you are experiencing is horrifying. And I'm not saying I even understand exactly all, but I know what it's like to be afraid in the society one lives in, what it feels like to be afraid to walk outside your home, to not know what's going to happen to you by the end of the day. I live in a society, right, where last year, more black people were killed by law enforcement than any other previous year on record, despite Black Lives Matter. I live in a country where over the last 10 years, there have been 1.6 excess deaths of black Americans in this country. So I'm here to tell you not to compare, but you have a right to be afraid. All I can tell you is the hope is, be afraid, but we gotta do stuff anyway. And the best way to do something when you're afraid is to do it together and to recognize that you are not alone. Each and every day, I'm lucky enough to travel this country and meet people in small and large communities who understand this is not about winning or losing. It's that we believe that we have something in common And we want to show up. We want to take that next step. So what gives me hope is actually a Jewish phrase. Rabbi Myron Kinberg, who you know, who's passed in Oregon, talked to me once about the phrase dayenu, right? And the way that he explained it was dayenu, Eric, he said, as he was eating his fish sandwich with cheese, his substitute for a cheeseburger, was you have to treat every single step as if it is the total victory. It is not about worrying about the step that came before or the step that will come after. That is the true idea of dayenu. So what gives me hope is today we have all done our dayenu. And when we walk out these doors, I'm going to be curious what this civil rights movement looks like and how it starts, not with the politicians, but with the artists. That's what gives me hope right now.
Bravo.
Now I have the misfortune of closing a panel after Eric Ward.
Oh.
You can do it.
I will say I grew up with that fish sandwich with cheese in a kosher household with the two sets of dishes and the Passover counters and all of that. And so I so appreciate that you, I think the fact that you know about the fish sandwich with cheese might give me hope, right? Like that we are building those relationships and those bridges. Look, I think we have no other choice. At the end of the day, if we are putting up walls, if we are tearing down our relationships with others, if we're saying we're going to go this alone and look at anti-Semitism as a particularized challenge as opposed to a universal one, we're never going to be safe. We know where sort of retreating into our bunkers leads. We know where the increasing tide of hate and extremism and bigotry that we're seeing in this country leads. And so we have no choice as Jews or as anyone who cares about other community safety, our own safety, and our democracy to lean into these conversations in this moment. I talked earlier about the hope I found in the Jewish organizations around the country mobilizing in October against Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate. I'll share like a couple more brief anecdotes. For me, there's been a narrative that really has developed in the last 5 months that no one showed up for the Jewish community. And to be fair, there is a lot of isolation and there has been a lot of silence, and we need to call that out. But also some of the first calls I got on October 8th or 9th or 10th were from Black civil rights leaders or an Arab American partner or someone else who was just checking in to say, I know you're hurting, I know you're in pain, and I'm here, and you let me know what we can do and how we move forward here. And it's those relationships that have been sustained over the last 5 months, including the hard conversations, the ones that take on the elephants in the room and don't shy away from the very real challenges of differences of opinion between the Arab American community and the Jewish American community right now, or the Black community and the Jewish community, never mind all of the compounded and intersecting identities that we so often ignore there. And the fact that those were some of the first calls I got gave me hope. And the last thing I'll say is, going back to Charlottesville, there was a very deliberate effort, and this is true more broadly, but it was certainly true during the 4 weeks of our trial, by the extremists to normalize and desensitize people to hate. We are seeing this in the replacement and the invasion rhetoric that is pervasive in our politics, and the anti-Semitism, the white supremacy, the anti-Black racism that's pervasive in our politics. And we saw it in the courtroom where the neo-Nazis and their lawyers explicitly used Holocaust jokes and the N-word and anti-Semitism to try to desensitize the jury to their bigotry. And this was a jury that, despite the trial being in federal court in Charlottesville, largely came from outside of Charlottesville, from parts of Virginia that might not be as progressive as the city of Charlottesville itself. And in fact, I don't think it was a particularly progressive jury. And so what gave me hope is that despite that effort, the jury heard that, sat through 4 weeks of neo-Nazis trying to desensitize them to hate, and they came back and they rejected it wholly, full stop, finding every single defendant liable for the violence. And that matters, right? It matters that people were explicitly being pushed to buy into this vile bigotry, and despite a very deliberate and concerted effort to do so, they wholly rejected it. And so it's so easy to fall into the false binaries of this moment, to feel like we are each alone, that it's not worth the bridge building, it's not worth the relationships that so many of us have tried to put so much into. But we have no choice but to keep doing that. And I think that even in this moment of such pain and grief, there are those reasons for hope, those glimmers of hope, and we need to hold on to them and use them to keep pushing forward right now, because otherwise the tide of hate and extremism is coming and all of us are going to be swept up in it.
Amen.
Thank you. Well, Amy and Eric, you give me hope. Everybody in this room gives me hope. In the words of my hero, Abigail Scott Duniway, failure is impossible. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you again to Judy and Eric and Amy, and thanks to all of you. We're almost done. And as always, as we started this meeting, I would like to end it with gratitude. Gratitude for your openness. Gratitude for, as we like to say in our own work, coming and standing 10 toes down in your knowledge, in your questions, in your hopes, in your experience for these last day and a half. We've said this a number of times, but this meeting, this time together is just one milestone on what has been a long journey. For me, for many of you, this work has been life's work. For this moment, this conversation started in November of 2022 when I was invited to the CAJM conference on the future of cultural identity in museums and started to see that model of solidarity. And a month later, the White House called us together to start to form this national strategy on combating anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of race-based hate and calling for solidarity. And I had this aha moment. I had just met Melissa and I said, hey, I was just there at your conference. Guess what we're gonna do again? We're gonna do this for the White House and for the nation. The time that we had that idea was a very different time in some ways, but in some ways it's also the same. Perhaps the events that have transpired over the past year gave us focus and gave us some extra fuel and different energy around the urgency and importance of what we've started here today. And so we've incorporated and held on to that notion of solidarity as best we could throughout this meeting, and I hope that you felt it. And because Eric invoked St. Audre Lorde, I will do it again. Because she says there is no single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. There is no single issue struggle because we don't. I told her I almost got through it. We don't live single issue lives. And I think that's what we opened up today. Anti-Semitism is not a thing on its own. Racial hate is not a thing on its own. Poverty isn't. Misogyny isn't. They are all multiple issues. And we have to be brave enough and expansive enough to embrace them. And the beauty of the work that we're in the places that you're in, is that they are wide enough and big enough and deep enough to touch many, many issues. So we hope, I've seen that we have moved our goals for this meeting forward. We were able to bring this group together. Our goal at IMLS is always to lift up the strengths and the visibility of our constituents, you in museums, archives, and libraries, to highlight your strengths, to be honest about the places we need to stretch to build capacity to fulfill the promise that we have to the nation and our communities. We know we'll be taking this forward very concretely in the toolkit that we've been talking about. I also want to, in the spirit of democracy, which is an action, democracy is behavior, democracy is action, to remind you all that you are empowered to take this conversation forward and actions forward. I hope you organize. Talking to Eric again, he's speaking all my language. He keeps bringing up punk rock. And we know what happens in punk is it's a DIY movement. You do it yourself. You are exemplars of doing it yourself. And when we move forward together, doing it yourselves, that's where we see push. And of course, IMLS is always here to help amplify those good ideas and help to move them forward. So thank you again. Thank you for engaging with your whole hearts and your whole minds over the last day and a half. And now it is my pleasure to welcome my partner in this, our partner, Melissa, to the stage to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara, and thank all of you for being here these last 2 days. We know it was a big ask, and you all came, and you all delivered. And when we set out on this work, we realized that what it would take to do this work now would be difficult. After October 7th, it felt impossible sometimes to know what to do, what to say, but we also knew that we had to proceed. And I talk about it this way with a lot of my members who are in touch with me frequently, that your doors are open. They're still open. I haven't heard of anyone who has closed their doors. Your websites are live, and I can tell you that whether it is everyday people, whether it is funders, whether it's journalists, they are there. They are looking for the inspiration. It is also possible that they're looking to find who's with us, who's against us, but more people than not are looking for something useful. They are genuinely searching for something useful. And you are all the public-facing repositories of our heritages, and people are looking to make links and to find something to move forward with. So even though you're here today and we have completed one of our actions in this strategy, what you are doing by staying open and being a resource every day is continuing that work. CAJM is here today, and CAJM is here today because of its long-standing relationships. Most of you know we are not a bricks and mortar organization. We are not a large organization. We are a limited operation, but we are here and we have been around for more than 40 years because of relationships. We owe the foundation of that to our member anchor organizations and our more than 70 Jewish museum projects who have stayed in the room. And I can tell you, you might think the Jewish community is monolithic. It is so far from that. And what our member museums are hearing and talking about and wrestling with is, yes, a lot of feelings of passion and forward momentum and what has to be done, but also a tremendously diverse array of opinions and possibilities. Longtime partners such as AAM, AAAM, our advisors to this program, David Achman and Kendall Pinkney and Ed Teppern, who was holding our hand last night and helping us see ways forward, Vidette, Jorge Zamanillo, and long-standing allies and advisors, Kinshasa Conwell, who was here last night, Lisa Sasaki, who we heard from, Lou Cove, Sarah Ferrone. They've been at the table with us for more than a decade. And that's why we didn't fall apart even when our communities were falling apart. One of the things that has been a prominent theme to me is that our work is fundamentally relational. Yes, we are collections of beautiful objects and art and evidence, but the Jewish people have always been a global community that have always been in interactions with other people. Francesco said to me earlier today, it would be hard for him to look at any object in any Jewish museum and not see that it's about multiple people. So as we know our work is relational, how do we build a more responsive museology? Anti-Semitism and countering forms of hate has been our explicit agenda here, but the challenges, as we know, are nested and they are feeding each other, and there are going to be more challenges ahead. And I hope that we will find ways to, yes, invest in the long term of our collections and a story that we don't have to know the answer to yet. So much of what we're being asked to do now is to provide the answer, and part of the work of museums is the investment in the long arc of that historical narrative. But we can be more responsive, we can be more experimental, we can use these partnerships to do that. Some of the immediate things coming up, we heard from Vedette, who is so generously opening the portal. I hope people will submit ideas. I went to the AAAM conference last year. It was fantastic. This year it's on the theme of the anniversary of civil rights movement. So we have a lot of good reasons to be there. It'll be in Baltimore in August. CAJM's annual meeting is coming up in May in Washington. So please join us or send your staff members. It's on the themes of museum and democracy, and you could see how that is the next logical chapter for us. We're gonna have opportunities for talking circle conversations. Rebecca Krasner, raise your hand. She's one of the chairs of our Talking Circle program, and is just starting to curate what conversations do we need to have. We'll be celebrating Jewish American History Month with the Weitzman. We are also going to be on the runway taking people to Baltimore on the final day in time for AAM. As you've heard about, we already have our engagement guide. You could find it online. We're going to develop that as the toolkit readied in time for the May conference. We have ongoing online conversation circles, and Sarah and I have been talking about what can we do next to extend the conversations you still want to have so we don't lose momentum. And most importantly, we want to figure out what are the next steps so we could support your work in your communities on the ground, whether that's through dialogue, art making, co-creation, and co-learning, especially between museums and other communities. We're going to need your feedback. We're going to need your ideas. You will see the exit survey link, and there's a great slide with a QR code. And that's not only to evaluate the proceedings, but please give us the ideas for the next steps. We know that we have been honored to do this work officially as part of the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, but the real hopes of the national strategy, why it's a national strategy, is because you're gonna do the next work with us. Thank you. We're so glad you're here.